Hi, my name's Joe. I'm product manager here at Fairwinds, and I'm excited to share with you today about our app groups and policy mappings functionality, which is really a much better way to manage policy and guardrails at scale across multiple clusters. First, let's go through a user scenario. Imagine you're a platform engineering leader and you need finer grained control of how your Kubernetes guardrails and policies are being enforced. For example, you may want to define a set of cluster-wide best practices that all resources must abide by. Or you may want to create specific policy exceptions for certain resources. For example, maybe there are certain containers or workloads in a namespace that need to bypass certain policies in order to run. Also, you may need to ensure that certain mission-critical applications in your environment are compliant with additional security policies above and beyond what you have set as default, and app groups can really help you do that. So first, what are app groups and policy mappings? First, an app group is really a user-defined collection of Kubernetes resources. It's designed so that you can match on any Kubernetes metadata, such as namespace, kind, workload name, container name, etc. And best of all, an app group is also multi-cluster, which means that you can define an app group that selects resources across one cluster or many clusters. For example, you could have an app group called kubesystem that really just selects on the kubesystem namespace, and you can choose to set that group to match across all your clusters set up in Insights, just one cluster, it's up to you. Policy mappings are similar, except they are user-defined collections of specific policies. And so a policy mapping can apply to also one or many app groups. So for example, you may have a policy mapping that selects policies related to SOC 2 or ISO 27001. You may then choose to apply these specific groups of policies to specific app groups so that you can target certain resources with additional policy enforcement. Let's go through an example. Imagine I created 3 different app groups. Now remember, an app group can really be anything that you'd like it to be. It can be organized around business units, teams, product owners. It's really whatever you think makes the most sense for your business. The first app group I created is one I call all workloads, which essentially selects all the namespaces, all the clusters, and makes sure that this app group actually applies to every resource running in my Kubernetes environment. And you may want to create an app group like this if you want to enforce, let's say, a minimum set of cluster best practices across all of your deployments or all of your clusters. I also created 2 other app groups, one called e-commerce, which is for my e-commerce business unit, and that team uses 3 different namespaces, uses a search, payment, and cart different namespaces. I also created one for finance. Finance has their own namespaces for payables and payroll. Now, I've also set up policy mapping. So the first example here is cluster best practices. And you can see that there's a few policies that I want all of the workloads and all of the deployments in my Kubernetes infrastructure to follow. And in this case, it's making sure that I've got memory requests, CPU requests, and the correct pull policy on all of my workloads. I've also created a second policy mapping around security and compliance requirements. And this policy mapping has additional policies that I'd like to enforce above and beyond the cluster best practices. You can see some examples here around Trivy and Falco findings, as well as some select Polaris findings that focus on security configuration. With Insights, I can then associate a policy mapping with an app group. And you'll see here that that cluster best practices policy mapping is going to be associated with the all workloads app group, which again allows me to enforce a minimum set of requirements for all the applications and resources in my clusters. I then decided to associate the security and compliance policy mapping with the e-commerce and finance app groups because they are subject to some additional scrutiny from a security perspective, and I want to make sure that they are subject to those guardrails and policies. And so it's important to note that the e-commerce and finance app groups are actually going to be evaluated across both the cluster best practices and the security and compliance policy mappings. And that's because the e-commerce and finance app groups are essentially subject to the all workloads app group, since all workloads app group is selecting all namespaces and all clusters. Some other features I'd like to share about app groups and policy mappings is with app groups, it enables you to match on any Kubernetes resource, but you can also exclude specific resources so that you can create those exceptions. Policy mappings also let you target policies for specific contexts. So maybe you want policies to run in cluster, at admission control, or repo scanning, or any combination of those three. You can set specifically where you'd like those policies to run from a context perspective. And finally, everything that you see here can be managed as code, stored in your Git system, and use the Insights CLI in order to synchronize this with the Insights platform. Let's do a demo so I can give you a better sense of how this works. You'll see I'm in my demo environment right here, and I'll go ahead and explain to you a little bit of how app groups and policy mappings work using our Insights CLI. So first, you can see in my demo environment, I've got an existing cluster that's running, and I've got about 87 different action items here. And by default, Fairwinds Insights will scan all policies across all resources, which is great if you want full coverage, but can also introduce sort of an overwhelming experience of way too many action items to start with. And so this is actually another great use case for app groups and policy mappings, which is a way to kind of filter and focus your initial policies on things that you really care about. So again, you can see I got about 87 different findings here. And the first step I'm going to do is actually go into our CLI, the Insights CLI, and take a look at some of the new commands. So you'll see that there's this new command called enable, which actually it allows me to enable the whole policy mapping and app group use case for the entire organization. So I'm going to go ahead and enable that. And you'll see we successfully have enabled policy mappings. So what does that mean? Well, by enabling policy mappings, that means that the system is going to only create action items where they're for the specific app groups and specific policy mappings that you've created. Now, if I go and refresh this, you'll see that actually the action items list now goes to 0. And that's because we haven't created any app groups or policy mappings yet. So Insights is basically not going to report anything or show you any results as a function of enabling the feature, but not actually setting up app groups or policy mappings just yet. Of course, I can always revert what I just did by disabling the policy mappings functionality. And all of my findings, again, if I just refresh, will come right back. So again, this is really a way to manage the whole viewing experience so that if you want to be able to scan everything and have all findings, you can disable policy mappings. Or if you want to have a more focused experience that only reports on policy violations for the specific app groups and policies you've defined, you can then go ahead and turn on that feature. So I'll go ahead and turn that back on. The next thing I'm going to do is actually define my different app groups. So you can see here in my editor, I've actually already kind of created a few different app groups and policy mappings. The first app group I've created is called All Resources, which is going to match on every single resource across all my clusters. And I'm going to do this because I want to associate a minimum set of best practices with every resource in my clusters. I've also created a second app group for my finance app. And in this case, it's just going to match on resources within the finance app namespace that match the kind deployment. Now let's go look at some of the policy mappings that I've created. The first policy mapping I created is called Resources Required. And I'm associating this with the All Resources app group. And you'll see that the policies that I've got in place here are really making sure that the resources across in that app group have memory requests and CPU requests set. And again, this is sort of my minimum best practice that I want to apply to all my resources. And so that's why I associated with this app group. I've also created another policy mapping here called Run as Root. And this is actually associated with just the finance app group because I want to make sure that in the finance app group, none of my deployments have the run as root allowed capability. Finally, I've also created a policy mapping called Scan Images. Again, I associated this with all resources because I want to scan every image in my cluster. And I've enabled this by setting the policy to Trivy, which is basically enabling all the Trivy policies, turning on all the Trivy policies for that specific app group I've selected. So these are my app groups, and I'll go ahead now and upload this and synchronize this to Insights. And so the first thing I'll do is go and push my app groups to Insights. Whoops, make sure I do the Insights CLI. And success, I was able to upload all of my different app groups. Similarly, I'm going to do the same thing for my policy mappings. And that delete flag allows me to overwrite anything locally in my Git repo with whatever's in Insights. And again, you can see here I've uploaded those different policy mappings as well. So now I'm going to go back to the user interface. I'm going to refresh. And you're going to see that I'm actually looking at just 15 different findings. And so I'm evaluating the existing workloads in my cluster, and I can see that right now I have a few, you can see some of the policies that I've enabled are showing up in the action items list. So it's now a much more focused view on just the policies and the resources that I care about. And you can see here I've got different findings across various different namespaces, but I also have those specific findings for the app group, finance app, where I've got that should not run as root finding that, again, just applies to that specific finance app namespace. Now, the great thing about app groups and policy mappings is it can also apply to admission controller. So we'll go ahead and we'll go to the admission controller page here. And the next thing I'm going to do is actually try to deploy an application to my cluster into the finance app group with a known running as non-root user set to false. Let's go ahead and kubectl apply. Well, first we're going to create the namespace. Oh, we already have that namespace. Okay, I'm going to actually go ahead and delete that so I can show you in this demo how the admission controller will also evaluate against the app groups as well. We'll give that a second to delete. All right, now we'll go ahead and recreate that namespace. Excellent, that's been created. Excellent. And now you can see that because I have admission controller running in this cluster, you can see that when I went to deploy this nginx file that has non-root set to false as well as missing memory and CPU requests, I'm actually getting an error from Fairwinds Insights saying it denied it because it found this violation where it should not be allowed to run as root, which for us is considered a high or critical issue. So let's go to the interface and see how that shows up today. It just might take a minute here. Excellent, here we go. So you can see that this deployment actually failed as a result of a high or critical finding. And in this case, the container was set to run as root. And so we can see that our policy mapping for the finance app namespace is actually in effect here. So if I go ahead and fix that file, I'll be able to actually, redeploy it and pass the admission control. Now, one thing to note too is automation rules still work with policy mappings and app groups. And so, for example, if I wanted to, at the end of the day, bypass everything in the admission control by lowering the severity to low severity and setting the context to admission control, I can go ahead and do that. And next time I go to deploy that application, it will actually pass. And that's because going to the user interface here, I can see that automation rule actually came into effect and lowered the severity of that particular finding to low. So the point here is automation rules can still be useful if you want to do even further finer grain control over policies. However, with app groups and policy mappings, you don't need to learn the breadth of automation rules now. You can more easily manage your app groups and your policy mappings and even the policy enforcement behavior directly from the user interface and through the infrastructure as code. So hopefully this gave you a better idea of how the feature works, and we're excited for your feedback.